He was only 20 years old, young, energetic, with his whole life ahead of him. She was 80, frail, and the grandmother of his best friend. When news broke that the two had gotten married, the entire community was left speechless. People whispered, neighbors gossiped, and questions spread like wildfire. Why would a man so young marry a woman old enough to be his great-grandmother? In small towns, news travels fast. But this was not just news, it was a shockwave. The moment the announcement broke, it spread like wildfire across the neighborhood, through whispered conversations at grocery stores, over cups of coffee at diners, and across the endless scroll of social media feeds. Ethan, barely 20 years old, fresh-faced, with his whole life supposedly ahead of him, had married Margaret, an 80-year-old woman. And not just any 80-year-old woman, but the grandmother of his best friend. The sheer disbelief rattled everyone. How could this be real? Neighbors muttered. Surely this must be some kind of joke. But it wasn't. Photos soon surfaced, shaky, grainy images taken at the courthouse where the marriage had taken place. Ethan stood stiffly in a borrowed suit, his boyish features making the age gap even more jarring. Beside him, Margaret, dressed in pale lavender, her silver hair pinned neatly, clutched his arm with a frail but steady grip. They were not smiling for the cameras. There was no grand celebration, no wedding reception with dancing and laughter. Just two signatures on official paper, and two lives bound in a way no one could have anticipated. The shock turned quickly into speculation. For the young, it became a story to mock. Memes circulated online. Pictures of cradle and cane emojis, of exaggerated captions about love knowing no age. On college campuses, Ethan's name was whispered as a punchline. For the older generation, it was a scandal. At church gatherings and family dinners, Margaret's name was spoken in hushed tones, as if merely mentioning it carried a curse. For decades, she had been known as the sweet grandmother who baked cookies, who volunteered at the community center, who carried herself with quiet dignity. Now, that image had been shattered. And for those closest to the story, it wasn't just gossip. It was betrayal. Ethan's best friend, Margaret's own grandson, felt the ground ripped from beneath him. This wasn't just a strange marriage. It was personal. The boy he had trusted like a brother, the one he had spent countless nights hanging out with, laughing and dreaming about the future. That same friend had now married his grandmother. To him, it felt less like a wedding and more like an act of war. The family's reaction was explosive. Margaret's children, most of them in their 50s, reacted with fury. One of her daughters reportedly collapsed when she heard the news, believing at first it had to be a cruel prank. Another son swore he would never speak to Margaret again, claiming she had brought shame to the family's name. The town was torn between outrage and bewilderment. On one side, people shouted about manipulation and greed. He's after her money, they said. That's all this is. On the other, some whispered about loneliness, about how cruel it was to judge love when it appeared in unexpected forms. But love, if that's what it was, didn't erase the unease. Because no matter how many explanations people tried to invent, no matter how many theories they entertained, one truth lingered. Something about the union didn't feel right. The age difference was too stark, the bond too inexplicable. And behind every question, one demanded to be answered louder than the rest. Why? Why would a man so young, with decades of life ahead of him, marry a woman old enough to be his great-grandmother? Why would Margaret, after a long life already lived, choose to tie herself legally and emotionally to a man who could have been her grandson's peer? And why had they done it so suddenly, so secretly, without family support, without friends present, without celebration? As the whispers grew, the theories multiplied. Some believed Ethan had been pressured, that Margaret had somehow manipulated him. Others believed he was the manipulator, that this was a calculated move, a power play for inheritance and financial security. But there was another possibility, one few dared to say out loud. What if it was real? What if, against all odds, this was not about money or manipulation, but about something deeper, stranger, and infinitely more complicated, love? The shockwave of Ethan and Margaret's marriage had only just begun. And as the dust settled from the announcement, one thing became clear. The story was far from over. To understand the scandal, one had to first understand Ethan. On the surface, he was just like any other young man in his early 20s, restless, curious, a little lost. But scratch the surface and a different picture emerged. A young man shaped by hardship, drifting through life with no clear anchor, searching for belonging in places others might never look. Ethan grew up in a small, quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. His childhood was not marked by abundance or stability. His father had walked out when he was only 7, leaving behind little more than unpaid bills and bitterness. His mother, stretched thin between 2 jobs, raised him as best she could, but exhaustion often stole her attention. As a boy, Ethan was shy, withdrawn, often retreating into his own imagination. Teachers described him as bright but unfocused, the kind of student who had potential but seemed uninterested in following the beaten path. Friends came and went, but he often found himself on the outside looking in, never fully belonging. By the time he turned 16, the loneliness had calcified into something heavier. He dropped out of sports, drifted from classmates, and spent long hours alone, wandering the town or sitting quietly on park benches. People noticed him, but only in passing. To most, he was invisible. It was during these years of drifting that Ethan first crossed paths with Margaret. She wasn't a stranger. Everyone knew her in one way or another. She had lived in the neighborhood for decades, a widow who carried herself with quiet strength. To Ethan, at first, she was just his best friend's grandmother, the kindly woman who always had a plate of cookies ready when the boys came over after school. But over time, something changed. Where others brushed Ethan aside, Margaret noticed him. She asked him questions, real questions, about his interests, his struggles, his dreams. When his own mother was too busy to listen, Margaret's kitchen became a place of comfort, her presence a kind of gentle stability. Ethan began to linger even when his friend wasn't around. He would sit at her dining table, sipping tea while she told stories of her youth, of struggles endured and lessons learned. She spoke with a wisdom that fascinated him, grounding his restless energy. To Ethan, who had spent years feeling invisible, this attention was intoxicating. For once, he was seen. By the time Ethan turned 18, his life was at a crossroads. He had graduated high school, but had no clear direction. College felt out of reach financially, and steady jobs seemed scarce. He drifted from one odd gig to another, landscaping, delivery driving, short stints at fast food chains, never finding his footing. Through all this uncertainty, Margaret's home remained a constant. She became, in many ways, a confidant. Their conversations grew deeper, straying beyond small talk into questions about purpose, about what it meant to live a meaningful life. Ethan admired her resilience, her ability to weather decades of change and hardship. But admiration slowly blurred into something else, something harder to define. It wasn't just comfort anymore. It was attachment, dependence. While Ethan was struggling to find his place in the world, Margaret was facing battles of her own. At 80, she was far from the vibrant community volunteer she once had been. Age had slowed her body, her children visited less frequently, and many of her closest friends had passed away. The loneliness of old age is a quiet but crushing thing. Margaret felt it acutely, and Ethan's presence filled that void. His laughter brought life into her empty home. His curiosity rekindled in her the role of teacher, guide, and companion. For Ethan, the dynamic was reversed. Margaret became not just a grandmotherly figure, but an anchor, someone who believed in him when so few did. What began as an innocent bond deepened into something more complicated, a kind of symbiosis, two lonely souls clinging to one another across the gulf of decades. From the outside, no one noticed the slow shift. To neighbors, Ethan was just the polite boy helping Margaret with groceries, mowing her lawn, or keeping her company. But behind closed doors, the lines blurred. Their conversations lingered longer, their silences grew heavier, and a closeness formed that was both comforting and unsettling. Ethan's peers began to notice his absence from their social circles. Invitations to parties went unanswered. His best friend, Margaret's grandson, grew frustrated when Ethan seemed to prefer his grandmother's company over their adventures. The storm was brewing long before the wedding. And perhaps, in hindsight, the marriage itself was not the beginning of the scandal, but the inevitable conclusion of a bond that had been growing for years. For Ethan, who had spent his life searching for belonging, Margaret represented safety. For Margaret, who faced the slow encroachment of time, Ethan represented vitality. Together, They created a world that made sense to them. But to everyone else, it was a world that defied comprehension. And when the truth finally surfaced, it tore through Ethan's fragile existence like a wildfire, leaving behind only questions and judgment. If Ethan's world explained how he came to need her, then Margaret's story revealed why she welcomed him. To many in the community, Margaret was nothing more than the sweet, elderly woman who lived on the corner of Willow Lane, famous for her homemade pies and her gentle smile. But behind that warmth lay a lifetime of trials, triumphs, and unspoken secrets that shaped the woman Ethan would one day marry. Margaret was born in the 1940s, in a world that looked very different from the one Ethan knew. Her childhood was marked by discipline, responsibility, and sacrifice. She grew up in a working-class household where dreams were often replaced by necessity. At the age of 16, she was already helping to support her family, working at a local diner while her brothers pursued factory jobs. By her early 20s, she had married Harold, a man with strong hands and a dependable spirit. Together, they built a modest but steady life, a small home, 3 children, and decades of companionship. To neighbors, their marriage seemed unshakable, the kind of old-fashioned partnership built on loyalty rather than romance. But Harold's sudden death in his late 60s left Margaret widowed. It was a blow she never truly recovered from. For years afterward, she lived in the quiet shadows of loss, filling her days with gardening, volunteering at church, and hosting family gatherings. Outwardly, she appeared content, but those closest to her noticed the lingering loneliness. Loneliness is not just about being alone, it is about being unseen. As Margaret aged, her children grew busier, consumed with their own families and careers. Visits became less frequent, phone calls shorter. The friends she once relied on were slipping away one by one, claimed by time and illness. Her home, once filled with the noise of children and laughter, grew unbearably quiet. Nights stretched long, and the silence weighed heavily on her. To fill the emptiness, she cooked elaborate meals she had no one to share with. She spent hours tending to flowers in the yard, though no one came by to admire them. She told herself she was fine. She was strong. She had lived through far worse. But deep down, Margaret yearned for companionship, not just polite visits from her family, but real, daily closeness. Someone to listen, to laugh with, to bring her back into the rhythm of life. When her grandson brought Ethan around during their high school years, Margaret never imagined the boy would become central to her life. At first, she saw him as just another teenager, polite, quiet, a little lost. She treated him the way she treated all of her grandson's friends, with kindness and warmth. But she noticed something in Ethan others seemed to overlook. He was different. While other boys rushed off to play games or hang out, Ethan lingered. He asked her questions about her past, listened to her stories with genuine interest. Where most young people dismissed the elderly as relics, Ethan seemed fascinated by her experiences. That attention awakened something in Margaret she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. Relevance. She no longer felt like an invisible old woman waiting for life to end. Ethan, once content to stay in the safety of Margaret's home, began yearning for something more. He was only 21, with energy and impulses that could not be contained by quiet evenings and slow walks in the garden. He watched from the window as kids his age went to parties, traveled, posted photos of adventures online. He scrolled through social media feeds filled with smiling faces, young couples building lives together. And then he would look at Margaret, her frail body, her trembling hands, and feel the weight of what he had chosen. The whispers outside began to echo in his mind. Maybe they're right. Maybe I've thrown away my youth for nothing. Restlessness curdled into resentment. Resentment into arguments. Their fights started small, about money, about groceries, about Ethan staying out late without explanation. But each argument left deeper scars. You don't trust me. Ethan snapped one night after Margaret questioned a missing $50. You've given me reason not to, she shot back, her voice breaking under the weight of fear. The house that had once been their sanctuary became a battlefield, silence often louder than words. Margaret tried to hold on, reminding Ethan of their vows, of the bond they shared. But her pleas only reminded him of the prison he felt closing in. The breaking point accelerated when Ethan reconnected with old acquaintances, Boys his age who had once been his drinking buddies, now curious about his bizarre marriage. They mocked him at first, laughing about his sugar granny. But in their laughter, Ethan felt a twisted kind of relief. For the first time in months, he was back among people his own age. He began going out more often, disappearing for hours, sometimes days. Margaret, left alone in the house, grew frantic. She waited by the window, the clock ticking painfully, her meals growing cold on the table. When he returned, disheveled and unapologetic, she confronted him. "You can't keep doing this, Ethan. I gave you everything. Why are you throwing it away?" "Because I'm 21, he shouted, the words tearing through the air. "I'm not ready to rot away in this house with you." The outburst left Margaret shattered. It was the first time he had said aloud what she had always feared, that in his eyes, she was not a partner, but a cage. As if their personal battles weren't enough, the community found new ways to remind them they were outsiders. Graffiti appeared on Margaret's fence, "Gold Digger's Boy." Anonymous letters arrived in her mailbox, filled with insults and warnings. Once, a rock shattered her front window in the middle of the night. The harassment left her shaken, but Ethan reacted differently. Rather than defending her, he grew angrier at her. "This is your world, Margaret. I gave up mine for this, and now I'm hated for it." The real breaking point, however, came when Margaret's children acted. Convinced Ethan was manipulating her, they staged an intervention of sorts. They visited unannounced one afternoon, confronting Ethan in the living room. "You're bleeding her dry," her eldest son accused. "We're not going to sit by and let you ruin what's left of her life." Ethan bristled, fists clenched. "She's with me because she wants to be. You can't stand that she chose me over you." Margaret, trembling, tried to intervene. "Stop this. All of you. This is my life, not yours." But her voice was drowned out by the clash of two worlds. Youth against age, family against love, suspicion against defiance. By the time her children stormed out, Margaret sat collapsed in her chair, tears streaming down her face. Ethan, instead of comforting her, walked out the door, slamming it shut. He did not return for 2 days. When he finally came back, something had shifted. Margaret looked at him with fear for the first time. He looked at her with exhaustion, perhaps even regret. The bond that had once felt unshakable was now riddled with cracks. Each word, each silence, felt like a reminder of the gulf between them. Neither admitted it aloud, but they both knew. The world outside hadn't destroyed them. They were destroying themselves. The breaking point had arrived, and what followed would determine whether their union survived or collapsed entirely. When a house begins to crumble, the collapse rarely happens in silence. It is loud, messy, and impossible to ignore. For Margaret and Ethan, the breaking point had been reached. Broken, humiliated, and alone, Margaret faced the hardest decision of her life. For months, she had clung to Ethan despite the world's scorn. But betrayal cut deeper than gossip ever could. One morning, she called her attorney. Her voice shook as she spoke the words. "I want to file for annulment." The decision was not made in anger, but in weary resignation. She had given Ethan everything, her heart, her trust, her name, and he had squandered it. For Ethan, the news came like a thunderclap. In losing Margaret, he would not only lose a wife but the safety net, the home, the defiance that had once made him feel powerful. He realized too late that his rebellion had cost him the only person who had truly believed in him. Their marriage, once a lightning rod of controversy, ended not with passion but with silence. Margaret retreated into solitude, nursing the wounds of both betrayal and regret. Ethan drifted back into the world of youth, but the shadow of his choices followed him everywhere. Together, they had defied the world. Apart, they were reminders of what happens when defiance turns into destruction. For Margaret, the consequence was heartbreak. For Ethan, it was a lifelong scar. And for the town that had watched it all unfold, it was vindication. The marriage that shocked everyone had ended as they always predicted it would, in ruin. In the end, their story was not about age or even about scandal. It was about the cost of defiance, the price of trying to live outside the rules without truly understanding what it takes to bear the consequences. And though their names faded from headlines, the question they left behind lingered in every whispered retelling. What are we willing to sacrifice for the love we think we want? And what happens when the price is more than we can pay?